Two pieces of setup. First of all, what does criminalization look like? This looks like the existence of criminal narrative post the economic emergency, things like investigations into whoever it is that make the public policy decisions, things like putting them in prisons, fine, etc. But obviously, only when this public policy fails to sort of solve the economic emergency or make it worse. But second, what does public policy decisions look like in times of economic emergency? First of all, some preemptive. We think that things that exist within the realm of corruption and mismanagement is irrelevant. We think that even in times of economic emergency, these things are still exist beyond the boundaries of law. There are still some degrees of constitutional process and procedure that they have to maintain. So things like corruption is obviously still illegal. Therefore, if that happens, they still go to prison and etc. But what does economic policy look like in our side of the house? This looks like fiscal and monetary policies like subsidies, increasing or decreasing interest rates, loan rates, asking for FDIs, asking for aid, and etc. This made by the government. There are also cross-sectoral policies, things like agriculture, mining, the expansion of industry as a way to sort of mitigate the short-term harm of the emergency and bounce back to industry and export and import, etc. To context here that sort of preempts the debate as a whole. We think that there are incentives to make these public policies really well. Beyond just the electoral incentive, because if you succeed to make your country go past the economic emergency and solve it, obviously that's good. A lot of politicians want to have that reputation, but we think that there are mechanisms in which preempts any sort of public policies gone wrong. This looks like there are phases and stages of formulation and implementation of the public policy. There are a lot of check and balances. You have to go to Congress or Parliament in order to pass this and etc. Right? So there are check and balances to make sure, even if it is somewhat streamlined in terms of economic emergency, we said that this is still quite robust. There will always be structural incentive and mechanism to mitigate all of this harm to even manifest to begin with. What will we prove to you in this debate? We will prove to you two things. First of all, in complexity and cross-sectoral issues. Second, I'm going to talk about the speed and freedom of decision making. First of all, on complexity. Note that economic emergencies are rarely isolated in just one country. That is to say that the huge web of interconnectedness of a global economy means that economic emergencies oftentimes happens in multiple countries at once. Why is this important and true to begin with? We think that the existence of economic emergency oftentimes happens due to the economic interaction between countries. This is what happens in the 1998 banking crisis in Thailand and Korea. It does not happen because of a national economic collapse. It happens because of stock market manipulation that happens in the US. But secondly, this looks like the pandemic that are inherently a global crisis. We said that it's very rarely for economic emergency to happen just in one country. But secondly, we know that the fiscal and trade policy of other countries inherently impacts your economy. Things like the web effect of interconnectedness in supply chain. So if a national economic emergency happens in China, it's likely to influence some degree of economic emergencies in Indonesia as well, because a lot of the market for a lot of the exports and imports that we have are oftentimes connected to China, etc. Things like contagion effect of sub-emergency that happens in their industry also happens in our side of the house. Things like currency and international private equity decisions like BlackRock pulling out investments from Indonesia because there's an economic emergency in Europe also means that an economic emergency happens worldwide. What am I trying to insinuate within this context? We said that it's borderline impossible to take into account everything to make a public policy addition to be perfect, because you have no jurisdiction in impacting public policy in other countries that affect you. Second, there's an unpredictability of political climate that exists in other countries, i.e. Indonesia cannot necessarily predict what eco-political climate that happens in the US that determines their fiscal policy. Thirdly, even you have the most perfect policy possible, we said that the chronological interaction of that policy and the policy of other country is something that you can't predict. I that maybe in isolation your policy is good, but maybe there's a policy from other countries that dilute the effectiveness of your policy. Why is this important and why this makes criminalization unjustified? We said that criminalization on principle is only justified insofar that you can prove direct causation and huge role of that person into the emergency in of itself. That's why, for example, we don't blame a taxi driver for driving someone and then later 2 hours and then 2 hours later he died, because you cannot necessarily prove that this grab driver have direct role in this person dying. You literally have to prove and pinpoint the direct cause beyond reasonable doubt. That's why, for example, if we have even a sliver of proof that this person might be innocent, we don't like criminalize them in the court of law. We said this sort of principle still applies in times of economic emergency. Second argument, on the speed and variety of decision making. Exactly because of the interconnectedness and unpredictability of economic emergency, oftentimes the prerequisite of a really good public policy decision is sort of the freedom to conceptualize and create and implement public policy, because you don't know and you have to take into account a lot of complexity within it. You have to take into account how the economic emergency affects your mining industry, affects your agriculture industry, affects etc. Why then variety is going to be really bad when there are criminalization? One, there are lack of incentive, or there are incentive to not play around with the sort of research and developing of the public policy in of itself, because politicians are preemptively afraid of making any sort of policy if they are criminalized afterwards. But more importantly, oftentimes criminalizations require preemptive regulation to manifest first. You have to go to Congress and say that, here's the thing, if the economic emergency happens in the future and it fails, the president should go to prison, for example. What does this mean? When economic emergency actually happened, we said that the sort of freedom and the sort of ability for the president to conceptualize the sort of public policy that they can make is oftentimes narrowed down to what the to the things that are probably mainstream, or to the things that are proven to be successful in the past, which is probably unlikely to be successful again, because sort of the details or sort of the unpredictability effects of the economic emergencies that are different in other countries means that the president cannot play around or cannot research more on the type of solutions and public policy that can manifest. Why is the important thing in the debate? We said that the vulnerability and the utility value of mitigating the short harm of economic emergency and reconstructing the economy in the long term is the most important thing in solving the crisis and eliminating the economic harm for people on the ground. We said that is the most important thing based on utility and based on the legal principle that I told you earlier, and for all these reasons, proud to propose. Stay here.
Ladies and gentlemen, in times of peace, governance is difficult, but in times of crisis, governance becomes almost impossible. Leaders must decide quickly. Data is incomplete, the public is panicking, options are limited, every second counts, and yet we expect our policymakers to solve these massive chaotic problems perfectly or risk going to prison. We think this expectation is not only unreasonable but dangerous. On behalf of the opening government, we say clearly that criminalizing public policy decision made during economic emergencies is unjustified. This debate is not about whether policymakers should be held accountable. Of course they should. But it's about how we hold them accountable, and when a policy failure crosses the line into criminality, especially when this policy made in times of crisis. Our side stands in three fundamental grounds. Firstly, we're talking about economic emergencies, situations like global recessions, debt crisis, inflation spikes, currency collapses, food insecurity, or pandemic-induced supply chain failure. Second, we focus on public officials acting in good faith, meaning they did not act out of self-interest or corruption, but based on expert consultations, available data, and public interest. Thirdly, we exclude cases involving clear personal gain, fraud, or bribery. Those belong in corruption courts, ladies and gentlemen. What we oppose is the use of criminal law, the potential imprisonment or prosecution of ministers or civil servants for decisions made under immense pressure, rather than political criticism or policy evaluation, ladies and gentlemen. As the opening government, our stance rests on three fundamental arguments. First, why policymaking under crisis demands urgency, not perfection. Second, why accountability should remain structural, not penal. And thirdly, why criminalization weakens the state ability to confront future economic turmoil in the future, ladies and gentlemen. Going to the first argument, why crisis decision-making requires urgency, not perfection. Let's begin with reality. In economic emergencies, policymakers do not have the luxury of full information. They have endless deliberation and guaranteed outcomes, ladies and gentlemen. So they must make a trade-offs between equally risky options. Often, every choice carries a cost. Let me give you a real example. In 2008, the US government made the controversial decision to bail out failing banks like AIG and Goldman Sachs. Yes, it looked unfair. Yes, it made some banks richer, but the alternative was a full collapse of the American financial system, which would have destroyed millions of jobs and wiped out millions people like savings. Imagine if those policymakers had been criminalized because of the bailout cost moral hazard. Would any government dare to take urgent and bold steps in a crisis? I don't think so. Another example, the case of Thomas Lembong in Indonesia. As a trade minister during turbulent economic period, he decided to import refined sugar rather than raw sugar in order to stabilize domestic sugar price faster. His intention was to protect consumers from inflation and food shortage. Today, he almost faces 4.5 years in prison. Let that sink in, ladies and gentlemen. A minister who acted to secure food security during a crisis is now labeled, or almost labeled, a criminal, despite no evidence of corruption. Now, let's analyze the consequences of this fear. When public officials operate under the constant threat of criminal punishment, their behavior changes. They no longer optimize for what is best for the country, but they optimize for what is safest for themselves. This leads to several implications. Firstly, policy stagnation. Officials delay making hard calls. Second, risk aversion. No one wants to try anything bold, even if needed. Thirdly, bureaucratic paralysis. Decisions are stuck in layers of approval to protect individual liability. Fourth, moral cowardice. Leaders pass responsibility to others, waiting until it is too late. In essence, we train leaders to be cowards, not problem solvers. We prioritize blame avoidance over effective governance. That's what happened in the side of opposition, ladies and gentlemen. And here's the worst trade-off. We punish decision made with courage under we punish a decision made with courage under pressure just because it led to harm, while allowing inaction or delaying or political cowardice to go unpunished, even when those cause far greater suffering, ladies and gentlemen. There is no justice, there is not good governance. In the long term, there is far more dangerous, ladies and gentlemen. Go to the second argument. Why accountability should be structural, not penal. We should fully support check and balances. But criminal law is not the only or the most effective tool for accountability. There are 4 structural mechanisms already in place in status quo. Firstly, we have parliamentary oversight, where decisions can be questioned openly. We have audit boards that can investigate irregularities. We have judicial review to assess if a regulation violates constitutional or administrative norms. Fourthly, we have public discourse in elections, where voters can punish failure in policy. We can punish failure in policy making democratically. So this system differentiates between error and intent, between policy misjudgment and criminal misconduct. Criminal law is blunt, rigid, and backward looking. It doesn't understand nuances. It assumes guilt and intent. It is good for punishing theft, not for evaluating economic policy. The more we use criminal prosecution for failed decisions, the more we can confuse between policy failure and criminal behavior. There's a dangerous message, ladies and gentlemen, because we tell our future leaders that if you act and fail, you go to jail. If you do nothing, you are safe. We think that's very dangerous. Our argument number 3, why criminalization discourages public services and bold reform. Imagine you are economist or technocrat invited to serve as a minister of finance or trade in the next administration. Would you accept? You know the risks, you know you'll face economic challenges, you might be asked to implement unpopular reforms like reduce subsidies, increase imports, float the currency. You do your best, but if anything goes wrong, you might face prosecution 5 years later, ladies and gentlemen. And I think that this fear of prosecution leads to 3 problems. Number 1, talent drain. So most of these qualified people who can be appointed to this very important position will refuse to join government because they are afraid for the prosecution. 2, policy stagnation. Minister will avoid making controversial but necessary decisions because of that prosecution, ladies and gentlemen. And fourthly, crisis of mismanagement. So government will delay urgent responses and fearing for future lawsuits, ladies and gentlemen. So let's look at the Greek debt crisis. Because after years of manipulation of fiscal data, the country plunged into crisis. Later, government implemented austerity that slashed pensions and jobs, trying to comply with bailout terms by the EU. Were those decisions popular? No. Were they harmful to many? Yes. But criminalizing them would have made the crisis worse because no one would dare to act. So ladies and gentlemen, government are not casinos, but they must take risks during storms. Penalizing every risk that ends badly will destroy the will to govern at all, ladies and gentlemen. Because of these three reasons, I think it's enough to win this debate. I think that's all. We beg to propose.